This program is presented by Community Television. A simulcast can be found on WRFP-LP 101.9 FM.
Welcome to the Chippewa Valley Sustainable Future Festival. Dan Zier presents Water.
Dan is a natural resource educator with UW Extension, and he works in the Chippewa Valley area. He's been in this position for 4 years. Prior to that, he worked as an environmental scientist for the Kansas Department of Health and Environment and as a research associate at the University of Missouri. He has also been spotted playing and singing alone or with assorted musicians in the Eau Claire area. He's quite happy to have his kids and grandkids all living in Eau Claire and enjoying Wisconsin with him. And he did really cool stuff with my students with the Pollution Pedal and Paddle Tour, and you can see a map of that in one of the booths in there. So that was off script, so I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thanks, Gary. The topic, the description in the guide is water. So what can you say about water? Lots of stuff. Water, what a concept. So some interesting facts about water. It's the only substance on Earth that comes in all three forms without human manipulation. You know, we can make liquid nitrogen, we can, melt lead into liquid lead and all that kind of stuff. But water comes in ice and water vapor and liquid all over the planet, so that makes it kind of neat. And water is less dense when it's frozen than when it's in its liquid form, which is kind of counterintuitive for a lot of substances. I remember when I was younger, we made weights for fishing, and we melted down lead to do that. And if you drop a solid piece of lead in molten lead, the solid sinks. That's not the case with ice. When you solidify ice, when you cool water down to make ice, the ice becomes less dense than the water. So ice floats, and this is really important because if you think about that, if you think about what happens to a lake when it freezes, is it freezes on the top. If water behaved like most other liquids, when it froze, the solid state of it would sink to the bottom. If that were the case, lakes would freeze from the bottom up, and it would kill everything in the lake. So the fact that ice floats is the reason why we can still have living things in a lake in the wintertime, which is really kind of a neat thing about water. Water is known as the universal solvent. It can dissolve more substances than just about any other liquid. And the human body is about 70% water. There's an old episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation from the 80s where they encounter some beings that are like all energy or something, and the beings communicating with Captain Picard and the crew calls the humans ugly bags of mostly water. And I thought that was kind of a neat thing because
Stole that from Harry Harrison.
That's kind of really.
Yeah.
That's kind of a neat way to describe us. We're, from an alien perspective, maybe we are ugly bags of mostly water. Interesting facts about water. We can go about a month without food. We can go on hunger strikes and we can fast and all that stuff. But more than 3 or 4 days without water, and you're pretty much toast. So we need water a lot. Of the fresh water people use around the globe, 70% of it is for agriculture. We think that most of the water that we use is going to be used for personal use, for washing and flushing and laundry. 70% of the fresh water that we use goes for irrigation and watering cows and other such things. 20% for industrial purposes, and only 10% is used for residential and municipal use. So a lot of the water issues that we have are because we use so much of it for agriculture. We all need water, and we need lots of it and often. So you've heard the phrase water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. You look at Earth from space, big blue planet, covered with water. About 3/4 of the Earth is covered with water. So this is a graph that just kind of shows you how much of that water is actually usable. So oceans make up about 97.5% of the water that's on the planet. So the fresh water that we have is only about 2.5%. So if we scope that out, of that 2.5%, 79% of that is trapped in ice caps and glaciers. 20% is groundwater down in aquifers where we pump our drinking water from. And surface fresh water is only 1% of this little 2.5%. So that will give you an idea that rivers and lakes really don't make up very much water at all on a global scale. So this is really the water that we have access to, is groundwater and then surface freshwater, which is not much. So if we look at surface freshwater and scope that out a little bit, about half of that is in lakes. 38% is tied up in soil. Now we're not talking about groundwater. Groundwater is the stuff that's down deeper, where you drill to get water for your well. Soil moisture is just like if I were to scoop up a handful of topsoil, there's water in there. It's moist. So 38% of the water is trapped in there. Atmospheric water vapor, there's always water in the air. Humidity, 8% of that. Rivers is only 1%, a little sliver there. And water within organisms, the water that's tied up in us ugly bags of mostly water, and all the other living critters, is about 1% of that. So just kind of gives you an idea that, yeah, Earth has a lot of water, but there isn't a whole lot of it that's accessible to us. And we have to kind of be careful and treat it precious. And some of you probably remember the water cycle, the hydrologic cycle from when you were in school. This just kind of shows how water moves on the planet. It evaporates. There's no urban setting in this graph, which I thought was kind of interesting, but we do get runoff from urban areas and from farm areas. But surface runoff, water moves on the surface, flows out into, flows into streams, flows into lakes, flows out into the ocean. It also sinks down into the ground, and you get groundwater recharge. The wells, the aquifers that we pull our water from, gets replenished by water that soaks down in. And that water moves too. It doesn't move like there's no rivers underground, but gravity will move water through soil and through bedrock the same way that it does on the surface, just much, much slower because it's moving through solid materials. And you get precipitation, of course, falling. You get ice and snow that's storing water. You get this thing called sublimation, which is if you've ever had ice cubes in your fridge or in your freezer for a long, long time, and you take the ice tray out and the ice cubes are really small. What happens is the ice is going from a solid phase to a gas phase. You think, oh, in order for the ice cubes to melt, they have to first become water and then gas, but that's not the case. Actually, what happens with ice sometimes is it sublimates. It goes from a solid form immediately to a gaseous form.
Water does.
Yep, another interesting fact about water. So that's just, water can exist in all kinds of different phases in all kinds of different places on the earth. We used to, when I worked in Kansas, we used to play this game with kids where they had a big dice that had, all the sides of the dice were a different form of water. You were a water, and you got a little card that said what you were at the beginning. You started out as a raindrop, or you started out as a chunk of ice in a glacier, or you started out as a drop of water in a lake. And then they'd roll the dice and they'd get to be, they would transform. They would go from the lake, they would evaporate and be a water droplet in the sky. And each time they changed form, they would get a little bead for a bracelet or a necklace. So it was kind of a fun little game that we used to play with kids to try to teach them the water cycle and teach them how water moves in the environment. Global water issues. There are a lot of them. Lack of adequate supply is certainly one. Water is not necessarily always where we need it, and not in the quantities that we need it for human consumption and human purposes. So adequate supply is a problem to deal with. And not only just supply, but potable water, water that you can drink. There may be water near where you live, but it may not necessarily be water that's drinkable. It may be so polluted or full of human waste or whatever that it's just not anything that you can drink. So that's a problem. Depletion of groundwater is an issue. As we pump water through out of wells and out of aquifers, we're starting to see areas of the planet where groundwater levels are dropping, and farmers and people who are digging wells for drinking water have to drill down farther and farther and farther to get at drinking water. Melting glaciers, in other words, climate change issues, I guess, is kind of what I'm talking about. As we start to experience climate change, it's starting to affect water on a global scale in many different forms. We'll talk about a few of those in a little bit. Pollution is always a problem in various places, some places worse than others. A lot of other problems with water. So right now we're experiencing quite a drought in most. I don't know if you guys saw the statistic that more than half of the counties in the U.S. are now declared environmental disaster areas. That's the first time that's ever happened. Not just in a state, more than half the counties in the country are now disaster areas because of drought. So this is a very widespread drought. And so you get things like, stunted growth of corn. What's going to happen to food prices because of this? Corn's going to go up, of course, and just about anything that you buy nowadays has corn in it. So general products, cereals, whatever else that you're buying that has corn in it is going to go up. Meat prices are going to go up because we feed a lot of our livestock corn, even though they should be out grazing grass, which is what they're supposed to eat. We feed them a lot of corn, so prices for meat are also going to go up. I don't know if some of you have seen pictures of the Dust Bowl back in the 30s. A lot of pictures of like Nebraska and Kansas and Oklahoma. This is Phoenix, Arizona, just a few weeks ago. Looks a little like the 1930s, doesn't it? Of course, I mean, Phoenix is built in a desert anyway, which is absolutely ridiculous, but this is the kind of stuff you used to see in Kansas and Oklahoma on the plains and stuff back in the Dust Bowl Dirty 30 days. Finding water is an issue for a lot of people on the planet. We turn on the tap and there it is, and we get used to that, and we're very comfortable with that and happy with that. These are women in Kenya. They set out sometimes on a 4, 5, 6 hour trek every day to get just enough water to fill these 3 or 4 gallon barrels that they have. And they have these strapped to their back, but there are some interesting developments with barrels like this that have a handle on an axle so they can drag them rather than have to carry them like this, because that's a hardship. I mean, they're venturing out for miles and miles and miles to find this water. And some bright people decided, well, if we make the barrel round and put a handle on it, they can, it'll roll and they can drag it back that way, and it's a little easier for them to carry. But finding water for some families and that's basically their job during the day, is to go out and locate enough water for their purposes. Okay, a little bit more detail on some of these issues. Groundwater depletion. This is a map of the Oglala Aquifer, which covers a good portion of the central U.S. I used to, when I lived in Kansas, I lived up in Topeka, which is right about here, and I actually got to tour some of this area of Kansas out in the southwest, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But if you are familiar at all with the ecosystems in this part of the country, that's a short grass prairie, which is basically about that far from a desert. Stuff in a short grass prairie doesn't grow much taller than about that. And that's how, yeah, it's a short grass prairie. That's how tall it's supposed to grow. You're not supposed to be able to grow stuff that's or raise crops that grow this high in that part of the country, but we do. How do we do that? We irrigate. We irrigate a lot of corn out in that part of the country, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So as kind of a connection to this is a little, almost kind of the same part of the country. This is the Arkansas River, or if you live in Kansas, I found this out the hard way, you don't call it the Arkansas River. In Kansas, it's the Arkansas River. So make sure you don't make that mistake if you ever go to Kansas. But what I found fascinating is, well, the Arkansas River, I mean, that's a long river. I mean, you're going through Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and then eventually into the Mississippi. If you look on national maps, the Arkansas River is there. This was one of the ways that explorers got to the west. Lewis and Clark went up the Missouri here. Some of the other guys that explored the Mountain West went by way of the Arkansas River. They used to float barges down there and steamboats with passengers and cargo. That was a navigable river from its headwaters up here in the Rockies all the way to the Mississippi. The Arkansas River in this stretch of Kansas, right about here, doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. And the reason it's gone is because they're pumping the groundwater down so low that the water table is sinking so far down that the river is not on the surface anymore. The river has dropped subterranean.
It's dropped 100 feet since the '88 drought.
Yep. Farmers out there are, if they're on the margin, if they're barely making a living, and all of a sudden they have to drill another 100 feet down to get water, they're just going out of business. So, I look at this and I think, a river that size, okay, what would happen if we would do that to the upper Mississippi in Minnesota?
We're finding out.
What would happen if all of a sudden the Mississippi River didn't exist? What would happen if the Missouri River up in Montana and the Dakotas didn't exist, if we pumped the groundwater down so far that those rivers vanished? Or the Allegheny out east, people would be up in arms about that. And when I was out here in western Kansas touring the groundwater districts, the mayor of Garden City, Kansas said to us, groundwater is useless unless we pump it out. He said that. And the reason he said that is because there are Dodge City and Garden City and Liberal Kansas all have Tyson meatpacking plants. that employ 7,000 or 8,000 people in towns of 30,000. So when Tyson says jump, these cities say how high. If you look outside of the Tyson plant, Garden City was the only one that I toured, but if you look outside the Tyson meat slaughterhouse, basically, in Garden City, there are hundreds and hundreds of acres of feedlots where these cows are kept before they're slaughtered. They feed them corn. Where do they get the corn? The farmers out here are irrigating the crap out of it to grow it and pumping that groundwater out. So groundwater depletion is very, very real. These, you can see the saturated thickness in feet. These are from a few years ago. I would estimate that these numbers have changed, and this graph probably looks different now.
40 year.
Yeah, Meg.
Isn't the Ogallala a fossil aquifer?
It's recharged about an inch every 100 years.
Yeah.
It's not connected to its source anymore.
Yeah.
Basically what you get for recharge for this is you get the groundwater flowing from the mountains. The gravity is pulling water from
But it's cut off by the Pecos River and the Platte. It's no longer connected to that source. That's where it was.
Yeah, the Platte River, is up here in Kansas, and they're having, or up here in Nebraska, I'm sorry, and they're having some. You can see that this is one of the thickest portions of the Ogallala, and you can see that they're doing the same thing up there that they're doing in Kansas. They're watering the crap out of corn to feed cattle, and they're having the same problem. Farmers are having to go deeper and deeper and deeper to get it watered. So a little groundwater depletion story from the U.S. This is a picture of what used to be the Arkansas River near Dundee, Kansas. When I was out there, one of my colleagues was taking these pictures. This is an old spillway on the Arkansas River, and do you see any river? No, it's not there. It's subterranean, and it doesn't show up. It's in a really, really wet spring, they'll have a little trickle there, but you have to get up close. If you remember the map of the Arkansas in Kansas, where it goes up, kind of curves up north and then swings back south, that peak north is Great Bend, Kansas. That's about where the river starts up again. There's a couple rivers that feed it from the north, and that's where it starts to actually be a river again. But this is Dundee, about 50 miles southwest of Great Bend, and there's no river there.
How long ago did that dry up? Or?
It's been that way for 20 years.
Since the 80s.
Yeah, and this is looking upstream. You can't. The light's kind of bad in here. You're looking at a river of sand. There's no water there. That's the riverbed. And this is Mike Beeshold. This is a guy that he works for the city of Lenexa, which is a suburb of Kansas City, and we were out taking some pictures when we were out there. This is close to Garden City now, and he's out in the middle of the riverbed, and you can see what he's got there. That's not water in his hand. That's sand. And you drive over bridges over the Arkansas River all over that part of Kansas, and you look out, and that's all you see is this river ribbon of sand that runs off into the distance. And it was shocking to me. And everybody out there is like, so we need the groundwater. And it didn't surprise them at all. It didn't bother them at all. Pollution is another issue with water globally and locally. This is a picture in China. The thing that jumps out at you in that picture is the steam coming off that water. A lot of times we talk about water pollution in the form of chemicals. Water pollution can actually be thermal as well, which means that the water is a whole lot warmer than it should be. And around here, that causes problems with our trout streams. We've got a lot of trout streams in Wisconsin. And water temperatures are increasing. As climate change causes water temperatures to increase, we're probably going to lose a lot of our trout streams in Wisconsin because of that. It's one of the projections when they look at climate change models for Wisconsin. One of the things that they talk about is how we're going to lose many of our trout streams because the water temperature simply will get too warm. There was just a news story out last week that in Nebraska and Iowa they had carp dying in rivers. I mean, nothing kills carp. Nothing kills carp.
We should try this.
And they had carp dying in rivers because the water temperature in some of the rivers was 97 degrees.
Oh my.
Midwest. We're talking about the Midwest United States with water temperatures in the 90s. And and a lot of these guys that had worked for State Departments of Natural Resources and Wildlife said, I've been here for 25, 30 years. I've never seen water temperatures even approach 90, and they've got constant water temperatures in the 90s. Hopefully this cooler weather is
Northern Pike in Minnesota.
giving us... Oh, really? Yeah, and this is just a little kind of diagram of the different kinds of pollution problems that we have with water. And you can see on the top here that we have point sources and non-point sources. Point sources are usually things that come out of a pipe. Here's a factory, so it's got an effluent pipe of the water that it uses in its industrial process, and that water comes out. Chances are that water is going to be a little warmer. It's probably going to have some chemicals in it, but we've done a pretty good job with regulation since the Clean Water Act was passed 20, 30 years ago. We've done a pretty good job regulating places that have a pipe. We're able to regulate water treatment plants and factories like this. Large CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, CAFO. Large ones are regulated, smaller ones aren't. They have to have more than 1,000 animal units in Wisconsin to be regulated. Some other states do regulate smaller ones, but according to the federal regulations, according to the Clean Water Act, federal guidelines only come into play if you have more than 1,000 animal units in your feedlot operation. So those are kind of point sources, and then over here we have these more kind of indiscriminate, hard to describe and hard to monitor non-point sources. Runoff from streets and urban neighborhoods. I mean, sometimes that can get concentrated in a point. If you've ever seen the stormwater outfalls that are sticking out the side of a riverbank and the water's pouring into the river, I mean, that's taking all the water from the various streets in that neighborhood and concentrating it in that one pipe. But we still call that non-point source because it's coming off yards, it's coming off rooftops, parking lots, streets. Kind of a hard thing to regulate. Golf courses, farms, lots of runoff issues with farms in Wisconsin. Lawns, construction sites, mines. We'll talk a little bit more about mining in a little bit. So all those non-point sources, not quite as heavily regulated as the point sources are. Usually non-point regulations are more state-based because the Clean Water Act, Federal Clean Water Act doesn't focus on those. So Wisconsin has some regulations that focus strictly on non-point source pollution that you can read up on if you're really interested in what those are. Hard to enforce. Number one, hard to enforce because it's hard to track exactly where that stuff is coming from. And number two, hard to enforce because lack of enforcers. A lot of the non-point regulations are enforced by land conservation departments, and a lot of land conservation departments just don't have the personnel to do it. They just had another statewide, I think, 12% budget cut here a couple months ago. All the land conservation departments did. So they're, like everybody else, working on a shoestring budget. And then we have things like, really, really major pollution events where you have an oil spill, which we've seen way too much of lately. So I've used this word watershed a few times, so I just want to kind of talk about what a watershed is. An area that drains through a particular stream, river, lake, or ocean. You can think of it, we also sometimes call these basins. And a basin used to be, like a bowl. You'd wash your hands in a wash basin. And that's kind of how you can think of it. It's the water at the bottom of the bowl and then edged by ridges. And when you get over on the other side of that ridge, maybe there's another river down in that valley. So this is the watershed for this river. And watersheds will have all kinds of different things in it. Includes all the land area, smaller streams within the watershed. Also includes the groundwater flow. And again, water doesn't flow underground in streams. This is just the diagram that they put there. Water moves by gravity kind of through soil and through rock underground. And watersheds are nested within each other. Small watersheds are part of a larger watershed. And I'll give you a graphic here that explains that a little bit better. Okay, so here's the largest watershed in the United States, the Mississippi River watershed. All of this part of the country drains, eventually finds its way into the Mississippi River, whether it be via the Ohio or via the Missouri River, or there's our friend the Arkansas River again. All of that drains into the Mississippi. So this whole part of the nation, all the runoff from that part of the country ends up down here in the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see, you can't read it very well, but that's a hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a dead zone that doesn't have any dissolved oxygen in it, so it can't support any aquatic life. Aquatic life needs oxygen in the water to breathe, gills, all that kind of stuff you know about fish. They need oxygen in the water, and because of all the nutrients and pollution and everything else that's running into the Gulf of Mexico right there, there's an area that fluctuates in size, but it can get to be about the size of the state of Massachusetts, depending on the season. An area that size that has no aquatic life in it, or what aquatic life is there is scampering to get out because they're looking for oxygen. So we have all kinds of different things going on in the watershed, land cover wise. We have agriculture, we have cities with urban runoff, we have industry, and even though they show industry up here in the Rust Belt, as they call it, there's a lot of industry right along the lower Mississippi. There's a lot of refineries and chemical plants down there that also produce their own kind of water pollution and effluent. But you've got a lot of other industry up here as well. And there's forest. There is some natural ground cover out there too, forest, and out here you've got a lot of grasslands and a lot of cows feeding on that grass at times. So there's a satellite image of that area of the Gulf of Mexico off Louisiana, city of New Orleans here, and you can see just from a satellite image how much stuff flows into the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi Delta and why that would be probably detrimental to fish. This is what you're seeing is sediment, just soil and sand and stuff washing off the land and washing off through the delta. And there's phosphorus in there, there's nitrogen in there, all the stuff that we put on our crop fields and our lawns to fertilize. That stuff is one of the biggest reasons why there's no oxygen down here, because you get algae that eat the phosphorus and the nitrogen, and then as the algae die, they're decomposed by bacteria, and the bacteria, when the bacteria are doing their job to decompose the dead algae, the bacteria are using up all the dissolved oxygen. We call that whole process eutrophication. A eutrophic lake is a lake, or a eutrophic water body is one that is starved of oxygen because of that process. So yeah, that's just a little kind of a look at that dead zone and all that's happening down there. So what watershed are we in? Does anybody know? Right here. What watershed is this? What's the closest water body you can think of? Chippewa, yes, but go smaller. Go smaller. Lowe's Creek. Gary knows. Lowe's Creek is just right over here. It's right in the trees back here. So we are in the Lowe's Creek watershed. This is a map of, here we are. Here's the Expo Center. This is 93, I-94. So when you came here, and then you drove there. Here's the Expo grounds right here. And you can't see it very well, but that's Lowe's Creek right there. So all the runoff that's coming from here is, by the way, that's a Rain to Rivers tattoo. If you come to the Rain to Rivers booth inside, I can get you one.
All right.
All of the runoff that's coming from all these grounds, and that's the Honda dealership up there, and there's the Metropolis Hotel and all that. All the runoff is flowing that way. And what you're seeing here, can you see the colors? Yeah, this is red. Black this is just the city boundary. Red is the watershed boundary. Does anybody know what watershed this is over here? Otter Creek. Yep, that's the Otter Creek watershed. Yeah, I mean, both of these eventually find their way into the Chippewa, which we were saying earlier. We are in the Chippewa River watershed. But as I said, watersheds are nested within each other. So it flows into Lowe's Creek, which flows into the Chippewa, which flows into the Mississippi, which flows into the Gulf of Mexico. So whatever we're doing here is part of that dead zone.
Yeah.
So that's the whole idea that we want people to understand with watersheds is somebody is downstream from you and somebody is upstream from you. So you're getting whatever somebody upstream is doing, and the people downstream are getting whatever you're doing as the water moves. So yeah, that's just a little watershed location, and it's kind of neat to know what watershed you live in. And there's actually an EPA website you can go to that will tell you on a larger scale, like Chippewa. It'll tell you on a larger scale which watershed you live in if you're curious. But most everybody around here lives in the Chippewa. They're the little small watersheds in the lower Chippewa River Basin. This is the upper Chippewa. Above Holcomb, Lake Holcomb here is considered the upper Chippewa. But this is the lower Chippewa River Basin, and all the little sub watersheds. There's Lowe's Creek right there. There's Otter Creek. Depending on where you live, you can figure out what watershed you're in. If you live out by Colfax, this is the 18-mile Creek watershed. Here's the headwaters of the South Fork of the Eau Claire. So yeah, you can find your watershed and figure out where you live. But you can see that they're all connected, and basically everything. Well, this area over here flows right into the Mississippi, but it's all coming down here through the mouth of the Chippewa where it enters the Mississippi. So we've got kind of the Eau Claire River, the Chippewa, and the Red Cedar are kind of the three main tributaries to the Mississippi at that point. Okay, ways that we modify and change watersheds. We do a lot of modification in watersheds. We cut down a lot of trees where there are trees. I grew up in South Dakota. We had 8 trees in our whole county. We knew them all by name. But around here, there actually are trees, and we cut down a lot of them. And what happens when we do that? What do trees do?
They hold water.
They hold a lot of water. They evaporate a lot of water back to the atmosphere, which causes more. I'm sorry?
Like big straws.
Yep. They evaporate a lot of water back to the atmosphere, which causes condensation, which causes rain. So when you chop down a forest, like in Brazil, talk about the loss of rainforest. You're not just losing the trees and the animals and everything else that lives in the rainforest. You're losing a mechanism by which that water is returned to the sky, so it can rain farther downstream. So we're changing climate when we destroy these big plants that evapotransport water back into the sky. We're changing climate when we do that. Other things that we do is we build a lot of structures that don't let water permeate into the ground. There's a big parking lot. Actually, after I looked at that photo, I'm thinking that must be like a outside of an auto manufacturing plant or something, because a lot of these cars are identical. So yeah, we've got this big surface that probably 200 years ago used to be grass or trees, and we've completely solidified the top of it so water doesn't get through there anymore. So that water runs off. It runs off and it takes all the pollutants that are in the parking lot with it, and it runs off into a lake or into a stream somewhere. So that's a modification, a negative modification of watersheds. We build houses, we build neighborhoods. And our old school, unfortunately, this is the way it's still done in a lot of places. Our old school thought process was get it off your roof as soon as possible, get it down your downspout, get it out into the street and down the storm sewer as soon as possible. Well, where do storm sewers go? They run right to the rivers and streams. So whatever's flowing, if you've got a storm grate out in your front, out front of your house in the street, whatever's flowing off your yard and going into that storm grate is going right in, chances are in Eau Claire, right into the Chippewa River.
It also doesn't give the groundwater, doesn't recharge the groundwater.
It doesn't recharge groundwater. It's taking a lot of pollutants with it. All kinds of problems when we modify land cover like that. I was talking to somebody inside. The theory goes that if you take your whole watershed, like if we took the whole Lowe's Creek watershed and we paved over, made impervious 25% of the surface of that watershed, we would kill the river. The river basically would lose its ability to support much of anything alive if you would pave over 25% of your watershed. That's pretty drastic. I mean, that would be a lot of asphalt and a lot of concrete. But in a watershed like Lowe's Creek, you've got trout, and trout streams are much more sensitive. You can start approaching the 8, 9, 10% impervious level, and you're going to kill the trout in that stream simply because the water temperature will come up too high. So as Eau Claire kind of encroaches on Lowe's Creek, that's something that regulators in the city and stuff have to keep in mind. And of course, we build a lot of roads, and they cause all kinds of problems in terms of hydraulic modification. A lot of times the water used to flow across that land, and now it's being moved somewhere else. And plus you're adding more impervious surface and more chemicals on the road from the cars and such. You might look at a wheat field or a cornfield and think, well, that's not really much of a land modification, right? Because they're plants. But it really is, because that land was not formerly monocropped with one kind of grass or with one kind of tree. It used to be a very diverse community, and it used to have plants that would be there for decades and would put down root systems that were 10, 15 feet deep. And when we put these crops out there that are there for a couple of months and then we pull them out, you're not establishing a plant community with a good, strong root system that holds soil in place, that takes up that water and puts it back up into the atmosphere. You're making an artificial plant community, which changes hydrology and changes groundwater and how it flows. So agriculture is a modification that has negative consequences for water. And I know, as I'm saying this, I know we need wheat, and I know we need corn, and I know we need roads. The point is that if we can find ways to do all this kind of stuff that aren't quite so intrusive, we'll be much better off, especially as we put more and more people on the planet who need more and more wheat and corn and whatever else. We also modify river systems with levees and dikes. We want to control flooding, right? We don't want our city, which we foolishly built right next to a river, to be flooded. So we build this big dike or big levee that keeps the water from rising over the dike and into our community. So these are modifications that this is. I don't know if you can tell. This is just a concrete side of a levee there. This is one that's this is actually sandbagged. That was the last episode of Missouri River or Mississippi River flooding that we had last year or the year before, whenever it was, down in the Iowa area. So you can see, there's a whole bunch of water here, and you've got this big dike or levee that's holding the water back. If you've ever walked in a city between a bunch of tall buildings when it's kind of breezy, what happens to the wind between those buildings? It picks up a lot, right? Because it's being funneled into a very small area. Well, air is a fluid, so air, gets funneled through this small space between buildings. Water is a fluid too. So as you build these levees and you create an artificial environment for the river where it used to spread out onto its floodplain, when it would get too much, too full of water, it would naturally just spread out on its floodplain, take some sediment, replenish that really good agricultural land that's in that floodplain. So then we build these levees, and we build them one after the other, after the other, after the other. What are we doing to the energy of that water in a flooding situation?
Increases.
We're jacking up the energy of that water, so when it does eventually find a place where it can get out, boom. I mean, it has all kinds of energy, and it goes out in a big hurry with a lot of force. So this idea of building levees is good in some respects. It's going to protect property, but somebody downstream might end up paying for that in a major way in a flooding situation. And you've probably seen the aerial photographs of when those levees just can't handle it anymore, and they don't, the water doesn't just flow over them gently and then gently flow out into the floodplain. It blasts a hole in them and causes all kinds of problems. So again, we need dikes and levees, but can we find ways to do this that aren't quite so dangerous and intrusive? We also control rivers by damming them. This is actually a very small dam. This is the dam on Meade Lake out in Clark County. Very small little dam. Just the South Fork of the Eau Claire River is dammed up there, and then when it becomes the Eau Claire River, it's dammed up for Lake Eau Claire, and it's dammed up for Lake Altoona to make these man-made lakes. So we've got a little dam there. There's a dam that's a little bit larger on a mountain river out in Idaho, I think that was. And then we've got this thing, which is the Three Gorges Dam in China. This is the largest dam in the world. It was just completed in the last couple years. That is a monstrous thing on the Yangtze River. So when we build these dams, we're creating a reservoir behind them to stop the water for whatever reason. Several reasons. Sometimes it's because we want to use the dam to generate electricity, hydroelectric power. And that's one of the things that the Three Gorges Dam does. It's a hydroelectric dam. Our little dams here along the Chippewa are hydroelectric dams. They create electricity. Sometimes it's for recreation. We want to build a lake back behind there so people have something to play on. Sometimes it's for irrigation. We want to store water back there so we can pull it out and water our crops. Sometimes it's a drinking water supply. When I was in Kansas, a lot of the little lakes, the little dammed up lakes in Kansas were for drinking water because there are, well, I shouldn't say no natural lakes. There's one or two kind of wetland areas in Kansas that in a wet year they turn into a lake. But there are more wetland areas. But there are no natural lakes in Kansas or Missouri. I mean, around here we kind of take water for granted. And a lot of parts of the world, a lot of parts of the country that aren't very far from here don't have that luxury. So they would make, towns would dam up a little creek, and then they would have a little, 300-acre lake behind that little creek dam, and that would be their water supply. Which I think in some ways, around here, we look at our lakes and our lakes get green and we go, oh, crappy green lake, okay, I won't go swimming. Out there when they see that, when they see a blue-green algae bloom in a lake, that's the stuff that they're drinking. So they get a little bit more concerned about it. So in some respects, around here, I think it would be almost beneficial if sometimes we used surface water for drinking. But in most of Wisconsin, except along the Great Lakes, we don't. Everybody gets their water from wells around here, including the city of Eau Claire. So just a little bit more on the Three Gorges Dam to give you an idea of how big this thing is. Over 7,000 feet long. The dam wall itself is about 600 feet high. That's large. That's very large. The cost is still, they're still not completely done with this thing. They're still doing stuff to it, but it's over $25 billion already. The reservoir behind the dam flooded 22 cities 22 Chinese cities, which displaced over 1 million people. 1 million people lost their homes to the flooding behind that dam. It submerged about 1,300 archaeological sites, and some of those archaeological sites were more than 10,000 years old. Old pagodas from 2,000 years ago were inundated under several hundred feet of water. Detrimental to certain aquatic wildlife. Fish need to move through a river. Sometimes fish need spawning cues. They need a certain flow or a certain water temperature at a certain time of the year for them to spawn. So spawning cues can get screwed up, and just fish migration can stop because you've got this big concrete thing that gets in the way. But again, I mean, they did this for a reason. They're generating 22,500 megawatts of electricity with this dam. It's reducing downstream flooding. The Yangtze floods often, and the Yangtze flows towards Shanghai and then out into the Pacific. And Shanghai, is not going to have the flooding problems that they used to because of some of these large dams. And it reduces carbon emissions. If they wouldn't have built this dam and got those megawatts of electricity, they would have built coal-fired power plants, creating all kinds of carbon emissions. A little on water and climate change. We're going to have increased incidence of drought as the planet gets warmer. We're already seeing some of that, and James Hansen, who's one of the kind of premier climate scientists in the U.S., has said, usually we don't point to a specific weather event as being caused by climate change. You can only look at trends. But he said that because of the severity of this drought, the widespreadness of this drought, and the intensity, that he said, I don't think you can really say that this is not a climate change issue. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And that was backed up by some research that they did too. Increased flooding as rain falls in more intense storm events. In Wisconsin, we're projected to have about the same amount of rainfall over a year, but that rainfall is going to come in more intense rainfall events. In other words, a longer stretch of dry period and then all of a sudden a 3-inch rainfall. And that has all kinds of implications for stormwater runoff and for farmers and everything else. So we've got some issues there. Glaciers melting, that's been documented quite well. This is just one of many pictures you can go out and find. This is the main Rongbach Glacier near Mount Everest. First picture on the left was taken by George Mallory. Some of you might recognize his name as a mountaineer, climber back in the 1920s. He took that picture in 1921. And this guy, David Brashears, who was doing a news story for AP, I think, I can't remember. He was there in 2007 and found about the same spot and took that picture. I don't know if you can see, here you've got, the glacier is pretty wide coming all the way down. And here, all that's left of it is just that little narrow flow, and it pretty much ends right there. So what implications are there for that? A lot of those mountain glaciers feed, especially in the Himalayas, they feed the Ganges, they feed the Yangtze, they feed the Yellow, they feed the Mekong. All those rivers have millions and millions, billions of people living on them or living off of them. And if those rivers dry up, where are those people going to get their water? And if they can't get their water where they used to get it, where are they going to go? Where are they going to go to get that water? Someplace where there is water. What about the people that live where that water is? Are they going to hand over their water rights to these refugees from the Ganges? All this stuff comes into play when we start talking about glaciers melting. It's not just, there's not going to be any glaciers, so what? Well, it's a little bit bigger than that. Sea levels are rising, ocean temperature is rising. This stuff is all documented already. Oceans are becoming more acidic as carbon is pulled out of the atmosphere, as we get more carbon in the atmosphere from all of our carbon emissions. The ocean is pulling up more of that, or pulling down, I should say, more of that carbon dioxide from the air, and that in the form that it takes in the ocean is carbonic acid. So you're lowering the pH of the oceans. And if you're a fish that swims around in a pH of 7.5 or so, and all of a sudden your pH is at 6.5, that's not good for you. Your scales are going to, not take very kindly to that. Your gills aren't going to take very kindly to that. So acidic oceans are a problem as well. Again, the whole issue of refugees and conflict over water. This is just one. You can go out and find all kinds of projections of shoreline loss and stuff. This is just one from NOAA, from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So most climate scientists are agreeing that by the end of the century we'll probably be a good meter and a half higher, which is about 3 feet. So in that case, we're going to start losing New Orleans, start losing some coastline in Florida. You can see the Outer Banks up here in North Carolina. If it's worse than that, if it gets up to 2 meters or 6 feet, Miami's gone. Most of the Everglades are gone. Most of southern Louisiana's gone. If it gets up to 12 feet, maybe 4 meters by the end of the century or farther, and that's really not that far off. I was thinking about this. My mom is 90. She's going to be 91 next week, and this is predicted by the end of the century. That's less than her lifetime. So it's really not that far away if you think about it. I've got grandkids that are, a year old, and by the time they're my mom's age, this is what Florida could look like. It's really not that far away. And if you see it up here, but all the way up the coast, Manhattan Island, New York City is fairly low, and Manhattan probably will not be around. Some issues close to home. There's a sand mine. We're just about out of time here, but this is the sand mine by Grantsburg. This is the one that, if you remember in the news a couple months ago, this one had a spill. You see these really nasty holding ponds out here that have that really sediment and sand-laden water. Some of that snuck into some of the tributaries of the St. Croix and found its way to the St. Croix. So we've got issues with water. Sand mines are pulling a lot of water out of the ground for their processing. These high-capacity wells that use 1 million gallons a day. 1 or 2 of those isn't bad, but if you've got a whole bunch of sand mines in the same little groundwater aquifer area, you might be pulling that groundwater down a little bit.
Especially in a drought year.
Yep. We all are familiar with the green lakes around here. There's an algae bloom in Lake Monoman from a few years ago. That's basically because, again, that eutrophication process, too much phosphorus in the water that feeds the algae, and that's what you end up getting. So what can you do? I've been like Mr. Doom and Gloom here, so I'm going to hit you with a few things that you can do. Farmers can practice no-till farming, plant marginal farmland to natural vegetation. Here you've got a soybean field with last year's corn crop residue still there. Why is that there? Why is that a good idea? The organic matter and the crop residue holds the soil in place. It holds soil moisture in place. That's all a good idea when it comes to managing the water on the farm. Install grass waterways. Basically, these are natural areas where water collects, or gullies might happen. So if you plant some grass in those areas, when the water flows to those areas, it doesn't wash the soil away. It's just washing over grass, which will filter the water and soak it up. Change ag practices to minimize the use of phosphorus in manure applications. We call that nutrient management in the field of agriculture, where you're managing the nutrients that you're putting back on your land. Keeping the livestock out of the streams is a good idea. Cows, even if they're not pooping in the stream, they're tearing up the shoreline, they're pooping close to the stream, it washes into the stream. So we want to try to keep them away from actually loafing around in the streams themselves. If you've got a septic system, maintain your septic system, make sure it's working right, because phosphorus can leach down into the groundwater. If your system is leaking, the soil underneath can eventually get saturated with phosphorus, and that phosphorus can start moving. So we need to be careful with that. And nitrogen too. We talk about phosphorus a lot here. Nitrogen is the problem when you get down into the Gulf of Mexico. Fresh water is kind of phosphorus sensitive when it comes to algae. Salt water, oceans are nitrogen sensitive. So we want to keep nitrogen and phosphorus out of water bodies. And use phosphorus-free products when you can. Fertilizers, that number in the middle, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, so that number in the middle should be 0. You don't want to have to put any... Get your soil tested. Chances are your lawn doesn't even need fertilizer. It's probably got enough nutrients in the soil where you don't even need to be fertilizing it, but the fertilizer companies will tell you, oh no, we have to do it 3 times a year. Well, did you do a soil test? No. How do you know you need to do it 3 times a year? Well, because that's how much money we need to make. So have a little criteria before you go fertilizing your lawn. Of course, we don't want anybody dumping stuff down the storm drains. And now, we used to have these we used to spray paint, don't dump, and now we've got these stickers. And now they're actually foundries are starting to make these grates where it's emblazoned in it, actually molded into the metal that says, flows to river, do not dump. So we're catching on a little bit with that stuff. Pick up after your pets. Dog poop, much like cow poop, has phosphorus in it. So we don't want that flowing into the streams. And use proper erosion control on construction sites. Here's a house being built. You can see the gullies forming on the bare dirt there. That's probably flowing right out into a street and down a storm sewer somewhere. Network and partner with other individuals or groups who might be working on some of the same issues you're concerned about. That's important. It's important that we have events like this where we're getting people together and getting people to talk and be aware. And I can't stress this enough. State and local government officials will do what they want unless their constituents tell them differently. So tell your local representatives what you want in water law and sustainability law. Otherwise, they're not going to do this stuff. Unless the public pressures them, they're going to do what lobbyists tell them to do. So we need to have a voice and talk to our officials and make sure that they're conscious about this stuff and aware that we're conscious about it. Talk to your family, share the information that you have. If you come to an event like this and you're garnering a little bit of new info, take that out and spread the good news. Participate in cleanups. We've got an Earth Day cleanup in Eau Claire every year. You can participate in that. There's invasive plant removal things that go on occasionally around the area. You can go and pull out some invasive plants that are dangerous to the environment. Build rain gardens in your yard to keep the runoff from flowing out into the streets. That's what we want, people to keep water on their own property. I've got a booth set up for the Stormwater Forum, the Chippewa Valley Stormwater Forum inside with lots of good information. I've got this is a really good how-to manual on how to build a rain garden if you're interested in how to build a rain garden. I've got some of these. And if you really want to get geeky about soil phosphorus, this is a really good geeky publication. You can pick up some of these too. So rain gardens are a great idea. There's a wonderful big huge rain garden on Water Street right across the street from the Haas Fine Arts Center in town. If you want to check that out, it's kind of a nifty site. Plant buffers of natural vegetation next to rivers and lakes. If you have lakefront property, we want it to look like this, with some trees and some natural vegetation. A manicured lawn, all that water is just going to flow right in there, and chances are this has got fertilizer on it that's going to find its way down into the rivers and lakes as well. Conserve water whenever possible. You got some graphics there showing you the shower heads and all those kinds of things that you've heard. Shut the tap off when you're brushing your teeth. Low flow toilets, low flow shower heads. All those kinds of things. Pick up trash and dispose of it properly. There's a shoreline near an ocean there with all kinds of trash that found its way down there. However, it found its way down there. We don't want that getting into the ocean. So pick up trash and make sure you put it where it's supposed to be. Buy a reusable water bottle and fill it from the tap. Don't buy those bottled water plastic things in the stores. Bottled water is one of the worst inventions on the planet when it comes to water issues, because it takes a lot of water to create the plastic that is the bottle, and chances are what you're drinking out of that bottle is the tap water from some city's water supply that Pepsi or Coca-Cola bought and are just filtering it through an extra carbon filter. That's really all it is. It's not, pure water found from an artesian well out in the middle of nowhere.
But if it's pure water from an artesian well, you're sucking up that groundwater, and the volume that they're selling is getting displaced from the watershed.
Don't run your dishwasher or clothes washer unless you've got a full load. Kind of an obvious one there. And shop smart for appliances that use water. If you're gonna look for a hot water heater or a washing machine or a dishwasher, they have ratings for how much water those use and how much energy they use. Those are good ideas. This is kind of an old school washer and dryer. I just had to buy a new washer not long ago, and I got one of those new fancy front loaders. And my old top loader would use about 30 to 40 gallons of water per load. My front loader uses 4. So I decreased my water use in my washing machine by an order of magnitude, which was pretty cool. I didn't know that they were that efficient these days. And water is life, as we talked about at the beginning. We're ugly bags of mostly water, so we need to take care of it and make sure it's clean and available for everybody. So that's all I've got. Are there any questions? It's just about lunchtime. Do I hear any tummies growling? Maybe.
Thanks, Dan.
This program was recorded and presented by Chippewa Valley Community Television. Chippewa Valley Community Television is made possible by continuing community support. If you'd like to volunteer or make a donation, you can contact us by calling 715-839-5067 or on the web at www.cvctv.org.